Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. Um, Thomas Hobbes, this selection on your book begins on page 134 with a little bit of biographical information. He's very different than St. Thomas Aquinas that we talked about last time. So, St. Thomas Aquinas was a Roman Catholic theologian living in the high Middle Ages, so kind of at the high point of the civilization, or the civilizational moment at least, that he was in. So the high point of Roman Catholicism. And we talked about how his great achievement was these kind of synthesis of classical understanding into Western, or more specifically, Roman Catholic theology. Hobbes lived about 400 years later. Most of his life was in the 17th century. He lived after the Reformation was well underway. So the Reformation was largely a phenomenon of the 16th century. Right, so 1517 was when Martin Luther started the Reformation, and then it started in England just a few years later. And in England, things took an interesting turn. So, in on the continent of Europe, you had some religious wars that started shortly after the Protestant Reformation, and then you had, really, in the 17th century, you had the 30 Years' War that kind of was I don't want to say it was an extension of the religious wars of the 16th century, but certainly it was uh, a new kind of a war that would not have happened without the Reformation the prior century. At the same time, in England, while it was not involved in the 30 Years' War on the continent, had its own war, and that was from about 1640-ish to 1651, maybe 1642 or something like that, to 1651, and that was the English Civil War, which was actually a series of conflicts that involved the decapitation of a king. You had basically two sides in the war. You had the side of Parliament, which we would think of as the Democratic side, but the side of Parliament and the Democratic side happened in this instance to be the more authoritarian side, the more puritanical side. That side was referred to kind of derogatorily by the other side as the Roundheads. Um, and then and then the leader of that movement was Oliver Cromwell, who spent some time as prime minister and some time as the Lord Protector of England. On the other side, you had the aristocracy, or the royalists, which were called by the other side cavaliers. And it's actually from this time that the word cavalier, which is a French word, or comes into English from the French, basically used to be a word that meant knight, and you can see how that would be applied to the aristocracy. But in modern English, the word cavalier usually is an adjective that is something you would use to describe somebody who was uncaring, and that that goes back to this period when the royalists were called the Cavaliers. So Hobbes was on the royalist side of this conflict. So we can see from the introductory essay about the life of Hobbes that he was, born in the, later part of the 16th century, right, in 1588. He was the son of a vicar. He was well educated, was conversant in Latin and Greek, got his bachelor's degree from Oxford in 1608, and became the page and tutor to the person who would become Earl William Cavendish. Right? And so he worked for Cavendish for most of his life. He was conversant in his life with English intellectuals such as Ben Jonson and Francis Bacon, so a poet and really a very early scientist. They did spend some time on the continent, right? Because the Civil War started here it is, 1642. I knew I had my date close. 1642, it tells us on page 135. He did go to the continent with the Cavendish family. While he was there, he developed relationships with men like René Descartes, who is an early rationalist French philosopher, Galileo, who we know as, of course, the important Italian scientist. He would become a tutor to the exiled Charles II, the King of England, who had been chased from his country. And then he would finally return to England in 1651 when the war was over. 1651 also is when the text that we're going to be reading from, the Leviathan, was published. Now, it's important to say a few words about what kind of war the English Civil War was. And it did have some relationships to the 30 Years' War that was going on in Europe at the same time. We had a transformation really in warfare that happened after the Protestant Reformation. In the High Middle Ages in particular, there were, of course, lots of wars, but those wars typically involved professional soldiers. And the professional soldiers were largely some kind of aristocrat. They might have been, lower nobility, or the servants of lower nobility, but it wasn't every man. And wars were limited in their scope, and for the most part, common people were not too affected by war. Their lives remained largely the same, regardless of who their immediate ruler was. Their conditions were, very prescribed. There were rights, and it's not like what you see in a lot of movies. The knights fought one another, not the people who lived in the territory that they were fighting over. Things changed in the 17th century. The warfare was much more total. And some of this makes sense because, one of the sides in the English Civil War were the people who were really advocating for more of a democratic society. And if you're advocating for a democratic society, if you think that the will of the people should rule, then you're going to have a lot of people involved in that conflict. Now, the two sides, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers in the English Civil War, I think they're kind of surprising to us, because we would tend to think of, the side of royalty as being the one who was kind of more moralistic and puritanical, but that in fact wasn't the case. It was the people who were the parliamentarians, who were religious Puritans and believed in having a puritanical society. It was the royalists, the Cavaliers, who were more liberal when it came to evaluating the actions of individual human beings and allowing for a diversity of expressions of lifestyle. And that surprises us. Sometimes we have to get over kind of our modern categories about what people are going to be like. So I think that's some good background on the war. The one thing that I do want to say otherwise about Hobbes is that Hobbes, unlike Aquinas again, Hobbes was not really a religious man. So there are some similarities between Hobbes and Epicurus, right? Epicurus was not a religious man and wrote an ethical philosophy based upon consequences. And Hobbes also was not a religious man and wrote an ethical philosophy that was based upon consequences. And so we're going to be seeing that. So right away, already on the first page of the text that we see on page 137, we see there's a seeming similarity here between Epicurus and Hobbes. Hobbes says For there is no such finis ultimus, utmost aim, or summum bonum, or greatest good, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers. So when we talked about Aristotle, we talked about how, although it seems like he's interested in consequences because he talks about the end of human behavior as being happiness, it's not really what we think, because there's this teleological cause out there. And for Aristotle, happiness is brought about by learning how to desire the right things. And ultimately, there's this unmoved mover that's drawing you in, right? Hobbes doesn't believe in anything like the unmoved mover. He doesn't think there's any kind of natural end out there that we're all striving towards. He thinks that all of us are trying to actualize our desires, and we're doing whatever it takes to get that done, even if we have different desires, right? He says, and this is again on page 137, felicity, right? And that's happiness, right? Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but in the way of the latter, right? So he has this different concept. In Aristotle, there's almost this concept of rest. Once you are living the virtuous life, it's going to be more restful. But for Hobbes, since he doesn't believe that there is really anything that is the virtuous life, it's not restful, right? You're always being drawn to the next thing. And then even when you're not being drawn to the next thing, you have a desire not only to enjoy things once, for one instance of time, but to assure forever the way of future desires, right? And so there's this desire in the human being for security, and the desire for security makes the human being want to achieve and actualize power, right? Power is going to be a key concept for Hobbes, right? Because power is what secures our ability to have pleasant things. And ultimately, that's going to be what is going to cause men to draw together. So on the bottom of page 138, he's going to give us an idea of where he's going in the text that we're going to read this time. It says, and this is right next to where it says section 4, right? Desire of ease and sensual delight, right? Because that's what we're drawn towards. Desire of ease and sensual delight disposeth men to obey a common power. So that's a power that's above everybody, or a sovereign. We'll find out later. He's going to call this the sovereign. Because by such desires man doth abandon the protection might be hoped for from his own industry and labor, right? So by abandoning ourselves to a common power, we can satisfy our desires better than if we have to wield the power ourselves, right? Right? It says, fear of death and wounds disposes to the same and for the same reason, right? Because if we're wielding the power of our own for our own desires, then we're putting ourselves at risk, because it's going to bring us into conflict with other people. But we're going to see that going forward, because in chapter 13, again, these are excerpts, that's why the chapter numbering doesn't make sense. He's going to talk about the natural condition of mankind as concerning their felicity, their happiness, and their misery. And you have to remember that he's writing this text during the war, right? During the war. And so he's seeing human beings liberated from the normal constraints of civilization. And as he's seeing that, he's thinking that this is the natural state, right? And the first thing that he notices about the natural state of human beings is their equality to one another. and this sounds good, but it's going to lead us to something unfortunate. So there on page 139, section 1, it says, nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind, as that though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or quicker of mind than another, yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit, to which another man may not pretend, as well as he. For as to strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination, so that's secret plans, or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. Right. So he's writing this before really the widespread use of firearms, right, which happened in the 19th century in this country. And in the 19th century in this country, one of the most common firearms was the Colt 45, which was marketed as a weapon called the equalizer, right, because it makes men equal to one another, because then they can all wield this power of life and death over each other. So this is kind of what Hobbes is getting at, right? And you might say he's not really talking about life and death, and really he is. It's going to become more clear, right? And then he also talks about wisdom, that they see each other as nobody really sees themselves as smarter, and he's got really a creative line here. He says, that which may perhaps make such equality incredible is but vain conceit of one's own wisdom, which almost all men think they have in a greater degree than the vulgar. That means everybody thinks that he's smarter than the average person. I think we can see that in our society. This problem is getting worse. It says, that is, than all men but themselves, and a few others whom by fame or for concurring with themselves they approve. For such is the nature of men, that howsoever they may acknowledge many others to be more witty, or more eloquent, or more learned, yet they will hardly believe there be many so wise as themselves. Right? So if you want to see this in action, right, go ask your relatives about politics, and you will see that among your relatives who are interested in politics, most of them hardly believe that anybody is nearly so wise as themselves. And then he says at the end of that section on page 140, for there is not ordinarily a greater sign of the equal distribution of anything than that every man is contented with his share. And we see that too, that every man, even today, seems to be more or less contented with his share of wisdom, at least insofar as he feels fit to comment on the political happenings of the moment. Right? So equality, which we might think is a good thing, he sees as something negative. Right? So there on page 140 in section 3 says, from this equality of ability then arises the equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. It sounds good, but let's see where he's going. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in the way to their end, which is principally on their own conservation, and sometimes their delectation only, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So our fundamental equality is what brings us into conflict with one another. Because if we desire the same things and we're more or less equal, then each of us is going to think that we have a reasonable chance of defeating the other one to get the prize. And so this is going to bring us into conflict. Right? Into conflict. So he's going to call this ultimately the war of all against all. Right? And he does that over on page 141. And he says there in section 8, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as it is every man against every man. Right? So this is any time that there's equality. Because when there's the times when there's not equality is when there is power to keep us in check, power greater than ourselves. And that's what he's talking about when he says a common power to keep them all in awe. When there's a common power to keep us all in awe, out of fear that the common power is greater than us, then we are able to cooperate better with our fellow human beings. But when we see ourselves as fundamentally equal to everyone, then there's not a power greater to hold us in check, right? So that's the state of war. And he clarifies there. He says, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto during the time there is no assurance to the contrary, right? Because the threat is ever present. It says all other time is peace, right? All other time is peace. And then somebody might say, well, what's the problem with that? Maybe that spurs innovation. Maybe that's a motivator to do well. Well, Hobbes is going to tell us, and this is paragraph 9. Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. Right? That makes sense. But then here's the other, here's the negative side, right? In such condition, so this is the condition of the war of each man against every man. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, right? Because there's not security. And consequently, there's no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So this is the most famous quotation from Thomas Hobbes. This is the one that you'll hear. The life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? But this is the natural state when there's not a common power to subdue us all, and we're all in conflict with one another because we all desire the same things and we are all equal. Right? That's what it leads to. No material culture. In the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Negative consequence. Right? Negative consequence. What does this look like in practical terms, right? When going to sleep, he locks his doors. Even when in his own house, he locks his chests. And this, when he knows there be laws, public. Sorry. That didn't fit. I forgot how he was fitting this in. He was talking about how we protect what's ours, even when there are laws, right? Even when there are laws, we lock our doors. Even when there are laws, we lock the chests inside of our house. How much worse would it be when there were no laws? Okay. And then on 143, he clarifies the state of war some more. To this war of every man against every man, right, which is the state of nature. This is the natural condition. This war of every man against every man. This also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no justice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. Justice and injustice are none of the faculties, neither of the body nor of the mind. If they were, they might be in a man that were alone in the world, as well as in his senses and passions. They are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. It is consequent also to the same condition that there be no propriety, no dominion, no mine and thine distinct, but only that to be every man's that he can get, and for so long as he can keep it, and thus much for the ill condition which man by nature is actually placed in. Right? So the natural state is really awful. And moral structures then are going to be created by men, and they're created by having some greater power to keep us all in awe, and they're created to actualize our living a better life because of the consequence. Right? He does mention briefly there on section 14 that he's going to talk about laws of nature. Okay, and that law of nature is going to be that you're willing to give stuff up to save your life. That's what that law of nature is going to be. Next, Hobbes is going to talk about the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, and this is really the main point of this book, Leviathan. So, what the Leviathan is this reference to this biblical sea monster, is what it is. But that's not how Hobbes is really using it. He's talking about the Leviathan as being the state that human beings put together, and he's kind of using it in two ways. One is because it's giant, because it includes multiplicities of persons, but the other is that it's kind of like monstrous, and that's because human beings are monstrous. But the other image that he gives in the text isn't just of the Leviathan. He gives us the image of the state as a person. And it's kind of like an artificial person, but it's a person that we make. And it's the person that holds us together and the person that helps us to live better. And so there's something kind of almost of a secular religion about it. But in this next part, which is from part 2, we're going to start there on chapter 27, the excerpt, is going to talk about the Commonwealth, which is the main point of the book, right? And right away, and this is on page 144, he gets into why we are doing this, right? Why do men start commonwealths? Why do they come up with them, right? And he says the reason is that it's a way of getting themselves out from that miserable condition of war, right? That's why we do it. That's why we do it. Is because it gets us out from the condition of war, and it puts a central power out in front of us. Right? And so we can turn to the next page, 146, at section 5. Right? He's talking about the causes of the state. He says, nor is it enough for the security which men desire last all the time of their lives, that they be governed and directed by one judgment for a limited time, as in one battle or as in one war. For though they obtain a victory by their unanimous endeavor against a foreign enemy, yet afterward, when either they have no common enemy, or that by one part is held an enemy for an enemy, is by another part held for a friend, they must needs by difference of their interests dissolve, and fall again into war among themselves. So what is he saying? That it's not just enough to come together for a time, you have to come together into a state, that can hold everything kind of together in check, right? Section 13 on page 147, he says, the assembly of men come together that they may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will, which is as much to say to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person, and every one to own and to acknowledge himself to be the author of whatsoever he that so beareth their person shall act or cause to be acted in those things which concern the common peace, safety, and therein to submit their wills every one to his will, and their judgment to his judgment. Right? Every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men, on the condition that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth, in Latin civitas. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe under immortal God our peace and defense. So what is he saying? So that men can live as they want, and that men can get more of the things that they want or they desire. They will come together, and by agreement, all of them agreeing to give up their own will to the will of the sovereign, so that they can have security. And this is the fundamental kind of movement of what Hume is up to. So I would encourage you to read all the text. We are not this week going to be having quizzes on St. Thomas Aquinas or on Thomas Hobbes. Instead, do the reading and listen to the lectures, and then the midterm exam is going to be due at the end of this week. So the midterm exam is not covering the content this week. It's covering the content through the end of last week, but the midterm exam is this week. If you find that this was not enough to do this week, because I wanted to give you some time on the midterm, and so there's a little bit less content this week. If you find there's not enough to do, please go ahead and start reading Kant, because next week is going to be an intense week. We're going to have a lot of time to kind of get through Kant. We have to get through it all in a week, and that's going to be a little bit difficult. But that is the end. This is the week of the two Thomases. The two Thomases are very different from one another. Both of them very important. Both of them representative of their age. St. Thomas Aquinas of the High Middle Ages, Thomas Hobbes of the 17th century. Kant is going to be a man of the 18th century, and Kant is going to give us really an entirely new way of looking at ethics, something that we're not going to find in an ancient thinker. There's not a Greek corollary to him. He's not like Aristotle, and he's not like Epicurus, and he's not like Epictetus, and he's not like Plato or Socrates. He's something new. And he's something new, and he's coming out of this the 18th century. He does have some similarities to Hobbes, right? Hobbes was looking for a reasonable, rational way of getting out of the chaotic times of the 17th century. Kant is in the 18th century. Things had settled down a little bit, but there was still a lot more warfare, and we've got all kinds of different sorts of religious ideas, and Kant is going to come into that space, and he's going to try to give people a way to think about morality that he thinks will work for everyone. Right, so that's what we have to look forward to next week.